So we've answered question 1. Did Jesus really exist? Now we need to answer the much harder question number 2. Did Jesus really come back from the dead? And here's why this is important, because if Jesus didn't come back from the dead, but he was a real man walking around who performed miraculous deeds, like Josephus said, we have a name for that kind of person. Do you know what it is? It's a prophet, which is awesome and amazing and wonderful in its own right. But if Jesus was just a prophet, that means he wasn't the Son of God, which means that he wasn't perfect, which means, effectively, that his death for us, if he wasn't perfect, could not possibly cover over all of our sins and bring us into new life with God, just as Jesus' life with God was again reclaimed upon his resurrection. All right? But if the resurrection didn't happen, we don't have new life with God, and we are effectively without hope, which, frankly, is terrifying. But we can make a pretty good case that Jesus actually was resurrected from the dead. And here's where we're going to start. We're going to start with point number 1, which is the empty tomb. All right? You know, everybody can recount Jesus was crucified and he died. Nobody can make the case that he didn't die, because he really did die. People watched him. There was a Roman soldier who fell to his knees at the foot of the cross and said, "This man truly was the Son of God," because as soon as he died, the earth shook and the skies, they grew darker and people were afraid. Hence, a Roman soldier who had seen hundreds of crucifixions in his time falls to his knees and looks up at Christ and says, "This man truly was the Son of God." Okay? But I'm getting off topic. The empty tomb. Why was it empty? Well, if you are slightly cynical, like me, you can imagine if this thing is a sham, maybe the disciples did it. But here's the thing. There was a Roman guard outside the tomb. Now, Roman guards are not like ordinary people like you and me. Okay, if they are assigned a watch, they stay awake and alert the entire watch. Do you know why? Because Roman guards, if they were caught asleep during a night watch, they could literally be executed for falling asleep on the watch. Okay? It's brutal, but it's effective. Roman discipline, especially amongst their soldiers, was incredibly strict. So there was a Roman guard, which means the disciples would have not only had to come during the night, okay, the second night, because it's the third day, and either dispatch or chase away the guards, move a several ton boulder uphill, and potentially crack it. There's a little bit of mystery there, okay? And then move the body of Jesus, but leave all of his burial clothes inside the tomb. All right? Now, all of that seems relatively plausible until you think about this. The disciples literally did not have the manpower to overpower Roman guards, nor were they really inclined to. Okay, think about this. Peter, the one who we all know as the disciple, who is kind of like Jesus's guy, all right? He went everywhere with Jesus. He's probably the single most committed to Christ man that we can really think of other than Paul that we look to. And he's already denied Jesus 3 times. He's literally said, "I don't even know the man." Okay? And the disciples, as we read it in the New Testament, are in a state of mourning and hiding while Jesus is in the tomb. So they're really not in a space or even have the ability to steal Jesus's body. They really believe he's dead because he did die. All right? So it wasn't the disciples. They could not have overpowered the guards. They might have been able to move the boulder, but they wouldn't have been able to do both. And then they would not have been able to hide the body. And then we're getting into my second point, but we're not there yet. They wouldn't have been able to show people the living Jesus later on. All right? Now, what if the Romans took the body? Well, the Roman guards would not have taken the body. They wanted him dead. All right? Part of the reason that Pontius Pilate was willing to give Jesus over to the Jewish leaders, and they gave him back saying, crucify him, okay, was because Pontius Pilate saw Jesus as a rebel king who wanted to bring about his kingdom in a very militaristic sense to that area. So a body missing after they killed him does not look good for Pontius Pilate and the Romans. So they didn't do it. And if they had done it, when the disciples went around declaring that Jesus was alive again, all they would have had to do was bring out Jesus' body and say, no, he didn't do it. He didn't come back to life. Here he is. And then Christianity would have been, dead in its tracks. It would have been dead. What if the Jewish leaders did it? They don't want a missing body either. It doesn't make any sense for them to have stolen the body and allowed the disciples to declare that Jesus had come back from the grave. For the same reason that it doesn't make sense for the Romans. The Jewish leaders are leaders. They're happy where they're at, and they stand to lose a lot. They stand to lose the temple, they stand to lose control of all of the Jewish people, and they stand to lose a somewhat iffy relationship with the Romans at the time. So, the Jews didn't do it, the Romans didn't do it, and we can be pretty certain that the disciples didn't do it either. Okay, so we have the empty tomb. The second thing that we have as evidence for Jesus' resurrection is eyewitness accounts. All right, now, we'll go from weakest to strongest. There are two guys, this is recorded, I believe, in Luke, who in the days after Jesus' death are walking back home to a town called Emmaus. And as they're walking, they're joined by a third guy. And the third guy, noticing that these two guys seem a little bit down in the dumps, he asks them, hey, what's got you sad and down in the dumps? And the two guys say, haven't you heard? Have you not been around? The guy that we thought would be the Messiah has been killed. At which point, the third guy goes on to explain everything that Jesus did and said as revealed by the scriptures that they had. So most of what Jesus did and said was part of a prophecy that was recorded earlier by a prophet. All right? And this third person, was able to relate to the two guys who were traveling back which prophecies corresponded to Jesus and how he really was the Messiah. And so these guys are filled with hope, and they're like, who are you that you know the scriptures this well and you can reveal these mysteries to us? And all of a sudden they look at his face and they're like, oh my gosh, it's Jesus, which would be just the most wild experience ever, okay? And then at that very moment that they recognize him as Jesus, he disappears. A little convenient if you're a little bit cynical. All right, but we have two guys. The better evidence that we have is the disciples themselves. All right, now picture this. 11 of the 12 disciples are all in a room, hiding from the Romans, hiding from the Jews, and all of a sudden, Jesus is among them, and they just look up and they're like, oh my gosh, their best friend and leader is back from the actual dead. They thought somebody else had stolen his body, and here he is right in front of them. And they're just absolutely overjoyed. And he says, be at peace, I'm not a ghost. I'm here for you. I'm here to comfort you. Which is just incredible, all right? So we have 11 disciples. And then they go and they're just overjoyed, and Jesus leaves, and then Thomas comes back. And so 11 out of 12 disciples are like, we saw Jesus. And Thomas is like, I don't believe it. I'm not going for that. I'm not falling for that trick. You're not gonna get me unless I put my fingers in his wrists and my hand in his side. I won't believe it. Lo and behold, about a week later, all 12 disciples are together, and I'm sure Thomas at this point is like, it's been a week, we haven't seen him, ha ha ha, but also really sad because I think he wanted to be proven wrong, and all of a sudden Jesus is there, and Thomas says, oh my gosh, my Lord and my God. He's able to put his hands on Jesus, and Jesus eats and talks with them, and they're able to like see him, which is just incredible. Okay, so we have the 12 disciples. Again, if you're cynical, then this is kind of biased evidence. All right, the third case that we have, third and fourth really, is from Paul. Now, you guys may or may not know the story of Paul. Paul used to be a man called Saul. And Saul, obviously before he became known as Paul, was a Pharisee of Pharisees, you guys. He knew the law forwards and backwards and all the ways in between. I mean, if you put this guy on Bible Jeopardy, he'd be crushing it. Every answer would be right, or at least nearly every answer, because he still didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. As a matter of fact, I am fairly certain that he was the one who was responsible for the death of Stephen. Now, he didn't actually stone Stephen, but he was the guy on the sideline like, here, you want to go stone him? Here, I'll hold your coat. Here, I'll hold your coat. That's cool with me. And then he went to the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem and he said, give me the arresting order, the APB, if you will, to find and then kill the Christians that are among our people, even though they weren't even known as Christians back then. They were just known as followers of the way, because Jesus had said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. None shall come to the Father except through me. So Saul is on his way to Damascus to persecute Christians, and all of a sudden he is completely struck blind, before he gets struck blind, he sees this light, and everybody around him just like runs away or falls to the ground in terror, and like Saul just falls to his knees, and I think on his face, and because Jesus is in front of him, and he says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Okay, and he's struck blind. He keeps going all the way to Damascus, and once he gets there, he's told to seek out a certain person, and that person is told by God, go to Saul. And the guy goes, why should I? He's been persecuting people like me. If I go to him, I'm going to die. They're going to drag me off in chains. I might get stoned with rocks, okay? Like big ones. And God tells him, like, hey, I told you, you go. And the guy goes, okay. So he puts his hands on Saul's shoulders, and something like scales fall from his eyes, and he has seen the risen Jesus. He's a believer. He's been praying to God for 3 days, day and night, like, Lord, heal me. And he's not thinking Lord Yahweh. He's thinking Lord Jesus, who is Yahweh, heal me. So somebody who was persecuting Christians becomes a Christian, which is insane. And then he later writes in a letter, I believe, to, I think again, the Corinthians, if you don't believe my testimony about Jesus and who he is, there were 500 other people who saw him all at the same time. Now, Paul is writing this in real time in his day and age. It's a letter. These people who are receiving the letter can literally go to Jerusalem and say, did you see Jesus? Did you see Jesus? Did you see him after he died? And they could say, yes, no, yes, no. And you'd be like, okay, great. But weren't you there? And the person would be like, no, I wasn't. I was fishing that day or whatever. And he could say, well, you were there, right? And he goes, yeah, I saw him. Here's what he said. Here's what he did. And they could match those accounts to the other people who said yes. And they could also, double check with the people who said no, So he's not writing to people who are just going to blindly follow. He's writing to people who are going to double check. They're going to be writing bibliographies on this stuff. So 500 people saw him on the same day after he died. And that is a fantastic historical case for the resurrected Jesus. So we have the empty tomb. We have eyewitnesses. We have people who persecuted Christ following him. And that leads me to my fourth point, actually, in the case for a resurrected Jesus who literally died, was in the grave for 3 days, and then picked up his life again in his glorified body and said, I am still the way, the truth, and the life. None shall come to the Father except through me. Believe in me. And that's the lives of the disciples. Think about it. If all of this was a hoax, it would be incredibly cruel, but also we would be seeing somebody who benefits from it. And the lives of the disciples who are telling the world about this resurrected Jesus who is king with God over the entirety of all things created, their lives did not get significantly better after they started telling the good news to people. All right? Like, they gave everything for Jesus. And you really don't do that unless you're pretty dang sure that what you believe is worth living for and dying for. So that's it. That is the case, not only for the historical Jesus, but for the resurrected Jesus. All right? We have 3 accounts of him being an actual human being, and we have 4 different arguments for a resurrected Jesus who comes out of the grave. This is the central point of faith in Christianity. And what I want you to do is I really want you to think about this. Is this something that I can believe? All right? And if you're curious about my sources, I would love it if you check out the links below. You can also click subscribe. I think it's going to be down here somewhere or something like that. And that way you can get a little notification every time the next faith video or the next hope video or the next love video comes out. And that concludes our first episode in our series on faith. What the heck do we Christians believe? See you next time.